Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we're going to start this time with something I've been hoping to do, and this time I was determined to. We're going to start with a bit of good news. On March 8th, the Senate actually approved a $107 billion financial program for the long beleaguered, long undermined U.S. postal service, providing relief for the agency and enabling it to improve services. The measure had already passed the House, and President Biden says he'll sign it, so in essence, this is a done deal. Called the Postal Service Reform Act, it overcame a history of opposition and nonsense from right-wingers who have attacked the Postal Service because A, it has a strong union, and B, it is a government-overseen service that works well and is popular, which are the two things that they probably hate more than anything else in the universe, except expecting the rich to pay their fair share in taxes. The Postal Service has endured years of losses triggered by slumping mail volumes and a 2006 bill that, among other things, required it to annually pre-fund the health care coverage of their retirees out to 75 years in the future. In other words, the Postal Service was being required to pre-fund the retirement benefits for health of retirees who had not even been born yet. It was a crippling requirement, and it was intended to be. It was so crippling that it amounted to roughly half the losses that the Postal Service endured, and in fact, the service has defaulted on those advance payments since 2011. Now, this bill forgives those past debts and drops the requirement for the future, saving the agency $107 billion over the next 10 years. Significantly, the bill also allows for something long proposed by advocates. The agency will be able to contract with local, state, and indigenous governments to provide basic non-mail services like hunting and fishing licenses. Now we just have to get to postal banking, and we'll really have something going here. Now, this doesn't resolve all the questions revolving around things like voting access, electric mail vehicles, and the closing of post offices. But as far as I can see, there's actually no reason to consider this anything other than good news. But about 1970, Donovan recorded a song called "The War Drags On." I was reminded of that song while I was thinking about the fact that Ukraine has dropped from the absolute #1 spot in some news accounts. Not that it's being ignored or downplayed or not still being covered intensively and regularly, but rather that it was no longer the automatic #1 story of the day. And the reason that's happening is because this war, as the song says, drags on. Drags on in the day after day, crushing grind of, again, quoting the song, a sea of blood and bones, millions without faces, without hope, and without homes. We often do, keep up with this war almost literally minute by minute, exposed to it in a way that would not have been possible in years past. I can still recall Indochina being called the first television war. Maybe we should call this one the first internet war. But the results, our compassion is grated away by the ongoing visions of bombed-out hospitals and desperate refugees, but is then pushed and stretched again by the undeniable reality of war from which we usually have shielded ourselves by distance and time. Grated and pushed and stretched until we just feel desperately feel we just have to do something. And I fear that we are being stampeded into a spiral of war. It sometimes seems, it's not true, but it does sometimes seem that way, that every proposal coming out of the mouths of the supposed experts, the foreign policy professionals, the analysts, the commentators, every proposal to stop or even just limit this war all involves stepping further into it. A no-fly zone, a limited no-fly zone, whatever the hell that was supposed to mean in practice. A safe zone on the ground in western Ukraine, patrolled by United Nations or maybe even United States troops. Providing not just for Ukraine, not just defensive weapons like anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles and drones, but even long-range offensive weapons like those MiGs we keep hearing about. I can't recall the infamous words of U.S. commander in the Indochina War. it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. Mike Bazaar, a senior political analyst at the Rand Corporation, had a Twitter thread on, quoting him, "Acting on the basis of imperative-driven thinking, especially under time pressure in a crisis, is a common prelude to disaster." And that, I fear, is the possibility we face as the images of pain and suffering assault our eyes and ears, and Volodymyr Zelensky's emotional, moving, and quite understandable pleas for help prick at our consciences. Happily, which sounds really creepy in this context, but it's really just meant to indicate relief, not any degree of joy. At least for the moment, calmer heads are prevailing. For one thing, despite his pleas, Zelensky is not getting his no-fly zone. I mean, it all sounds so easy, doesn't it? Just protection, that's all, just protecting lives. Until you ask how you enforce it and what happens when you do. And how do you deal with the fact that this puts your jets directly in the target of Russian anti-aircraft batteries on the ground? How do you deal with the fact that most of the airstrikes, which are not even the main source of the destruction, artillery is, but that most of the airstrikes are coming from jets flying within the borders of Russia, just lobbing missiles over the border? The reality is that, as humanitarian as it sounds, a no-fly zone accomplishes very little, while creating chances. In fact, it creates the near certainty for escalation that would extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine, with casualties that would dwarf those seen so far, even if you assume that nuclear weapons are not used. For the same sorts of reasons, the same sorts of considerations, foreign troops, especially U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine, is a non-starter. And the MiGs, regarded by the U.S. Department of War as too much potential risk for too little potential gain, they're very likely not coming. Now, knowing all that, knowing that there are reasons for all of that, does not make what we witness any easier to bear. But at least we can take whatever minuscule comfort there is in that those with the power and the responsibility to actually make those life and death decisions are resisting the urge to think that we can end the horror by adding to it. Which also, frankly, makes me wonder what Zelensky is thinking. I mean, does he really believe, for example, that a no-fly zone would work, that it would not escalate the fighting? Is he thinking, just as the U.S. and NATO falsely thought before the war began, that Putin could just be bullied into outright retreat? Or is he more likely, in the face of what his people are suffering, getting to that imperative-driven thinking that Mike Bazaar was warning against? If that's true, then frankly, the caution of others is even more necessary. Still, there is hope to be found. There are talks, really, what you should call it, but there are negotiations going on between officials of Russia and Ukraine, and both sides are projecting some degree of optimism. After the last round, which took place the day before I'm doing this, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Representative Dmitry Peskov both said a neutral military status for Ukraine, similar, in other words, to Sweden or Austria, is being seriously discussed, which is a major step back from the previous Russian demand for the total demilitarization of Ukraine. While for his part, Zelensky said Russia's demands for ending the war were becoming more realistic, while also acknowledging that there's really no prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, this does not by any means mean that peace is breaking out all over, but it is progress, and it starts to offer hints of what a final settlement might be. In the meantime, there are a number of groups offering direct aid to the Ukrainian people. Two that I can suggest, because I know about them and I know they have a presence in Ukraine, are Doctors Without Borders, www.doctorswithoutborders.org, and World Central Kitchen at wck.org. Okay, next up, we actually have the much anticipated return of 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. We start, as always, with the clowns. We've got two of them for you. This first one requires no explanation as to why it's here. Apparently, some of those truckers still trying to determine why they're wasting a lot of fuel wandering the commuting times of Washington, D.C., they're all huffy and teary about the fact that some drivers were basically giving them the finger when they complained that the police were not answering their calls about this heinous offense. Their feckless leader, Brian Blaze, suggested they flood 9/11 because apparently they think getting flipped off is an emergency. No need to go on that. This one, however, will require a little explanation. On March 15th, the U.S. Senate, by unanimous voice vote, passed legislation to make daylight saving times permanent and year-round starting in 2023. Supporters offered the acclaimed health and safety reasons for avoiding having to change the clocks twice a year that always get advanced whenever the idea comes up. So why is this here as a collective act of clowns? Because we did this before, folks. In 1973, during an oil embargo, we did the same thing with the idea it was going to save energy. But people forgot then, as apparently they do now, that having a sunset an hour later also means sunrise an hour later. And the enthusiasm for this idea lasted as long as it took for parents the following winter to see their kids waiting for the school bus in the pitch dark, and for people working the night shift coming to realize that going to work in the dark and then coming home also in the dark is not how they wanted to spend their days. Now, maybe I'll be wrong, but I have a feeling that if this does pass the House, we'll see the same pushback at the same time over the same issues. Until I'm shown wrong by experience, I say this is the work of clowns. Okay, moving on to our outrage. In two decisions announced the end of the first week of March, the Supreme Court upheld and potentially even expanded the pernicious state secrets privilege, a privilege that allows the executive branch to keep secret any information and so beyond the reach of any legal review in any case which it claims pursuing the matter would involve national security concerns. A protection to the point where the government will argue that even if the claimed violations of a law and constitutional rights are true, they're still exempt from judicial review. Now, technically, the courts have to accept the assertion in order to hold, but in practice, courts tend to be extremely deferential to the security state. The two cases were U.S. versus Zabida, where a divided court ruled that the government did not have to disclose information about the CIA's torture program at its black sites to a plaintiff who's currently detained at Gitmo. And U.S. v. Fazaga, where a unanimous court ruled that a case against the FBI for unlawful surveillance of mosques cannot be continued. What makes this the true outrage it is that the state secrets privilege is the result of government lies. It was invented in its modern form by the Supreme Court in the 1953 case U.S. v. Reynolds. In 1948, a B-29 crashed, leading to the deaths of 3 RCA employees on board. The family sued, claiming negligence. The government refused to release its report on the accident, claiming that to do so would damage national security. In fact, they claimed what was going on in that plane was so secret that the information couldn't even be released to the judge to review in chambers. The Supreme Court ruled that the government had made a valid claim of privilege against revealing military secrets, a privilege, quote, well established in the law of evidence, which it wasn't. It was in common law, but it was this ruling that codified it into practice. Here's the thing. When that accident report was finally declassified in 2004, it proved the government had totally lied. There was nothing secret in the accident report. The equipment on board being tested not only did not have anything to do with the crash, it actually was not even mentioned in the report. What the report showed, rather, was that the plane had experienced problems before and that had not been properly checked out before this flight. And that is, the report proved the very negligence of which the government was accused, and this invocation of the state secrets privilege was to conceal the government's negligence. The entire state secrets privilege is built on a lie, which makes its use to conceal torture and spying the clearest sort of outrage. Let's take a break. And we are back, and we're going to take the rest of the show by taking a longer look. Okay, this is something I keep meaning to talk about, keep thinking to include, but for one reason or another, I just don't for whatever. This time, I'm doing it. On March 14th, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom rejected a request by WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to appeal an earlier decision permitting his extradition to the United States, where he faces espionage charges and up to 175 years in prison for publishing classified documents that expose war crimes. There's one more option here, which is the hope that the UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, will decline to authorize the extradition, a hope that is very likely vain, since 3 years ago, then Home Secretary Sajid Javid was the one who greenlit the extradition in the first place. This business actually dates back really to the Bush administration, right through the Obama administration, right through Tweety Pie, right up to today. For well over a decade, the United States government has been out to destroy Julian Assange and through that to destroy WikiLeaks, an organization devoted to revealing what governments across the world do not want their citizens to know. The reason for this long campaign is because WikiLeaks dared to release hidden information that was embarrassing to the U.S. foreign and military policy establishments, most particularly released in 2010 of what was called the Iraq War Logs, which documented numerous U.S. war crimes, including killing of unarmed civilians and torturing of Iraqi prisoners. Something that drew particular attention was a video taken from a U.S. helicopter gunship showing that crew shooting down a group of unarmed civilians in a public plaza, including 2 journalists. A video that became known by the title Collateral Murder. It's still on YouTube. You can still go look it up if you want to see it. The problem, of course, for the government was that by prosecuting Assange or WikiLeaks for release of classified information, the government risked involving outfits like the Washington Post and the New York Times, which published what WikiLeaks released. In some cases, did it in consultation with WikiLeaks. The government was not prepared to take that on. Now, that doesn't mean they wouldn't try to find and didn't try to find a way around it. I still recall Eric Holder, the amazing Mr. O's Attorney General, saying that the Department of Justice would find something with which they could charge Assange, even if they had to change the law in order to do it. During the Obama administration, remember, by the way, how the Obama administration came into pledging a new age of transparency, only to wind up imprisoning more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act of 1917 than all other previous presidents combined? Anyway, during the Obama administration, the idea was floated to relabel WikiLeaks as an information broker, something to be declared entirely separate from journalism or publishing, and therefore not deserving of any free press First Amendment guarantees or protections. Now, that didn't fly, because how then do you separate WikiLeaks from any news aggregator like Google News or Yahoo News or any of the rest? The Tweety Pie gang was a little more creative. They got a provision inserted into the Intelligence Authorization Act of 2018, which called WikiLeaks, quote, a non-state hostile intelligence service, unquote, a term invented for the occasion by Mike Pompeo, Tweety Pie's CIA director and Secretary of State, and a label subsequently used in proposals from the CIA and from the great orange wig stand himself to kidnap or kill Julian Assange, who was then holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy where he was taking refuge. And this, by the way, this is also why Chelsea Manning was for several months held in solitary confinement, which is torture under international law, held in solitary confinement by the U.S. military and denied treatment for her gender dysphoria. It was an attempt to emotionally or psychologically break her so that she would testify against Assange in a charge of conspiracy to release classified documents. See, the issue of the freedom of press still hung over this whole business. But conspiracy, nicknamed the prosecutor's darling, was at least a potential way around that. But to make it work, they needed Manning's testimony. Because if she just gave the documents to WikiLeaks, then this conspiracy thing doesn't work. But if they could get her to testify that Assange talked her into releasing the documents, then, ta-da, you have conspiracy. That this was the intent of this became even clearer by the fact that when, after her court-martial sentence of 35 years was commuted after 7 years, which is still longer than any other whistleblower in U.S. history, Shortly after she was released, she was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury about her dealings with Julian Assange. She refused and spent 2 months in prison for contempt of court. And then almost as soon as she was released from that, she was summoned before another grand jury about the same topic. She refused again, spent another 10 months in prison, and accumulated a fine of $256,000. But while it appears the government has, at least for now, given up on trying to break Chelsea Manning, and Julian Assange is for the moment still free, the government has been pretty much able to cripple WikiLeaks. That can be seen from WikiLeaks' website. There's been a drying up of any new releases since around 2017. And in fact, there's only been one release of documents in the last 2 years, and that was about 2 hate groups in Spain. The case has sparked ongoing concern from press freedom and human rights groups around the world, who warn the prosecution of Assange will have far-reaching impacts on journalists and publishers who dare to challenge powerful governments by revealing their secrets. For example, in January, the Committee to Protect Journalists stated that the U.S.'s prosecution of Assange would set, quote, a deeply harmful legal precedent that would allow the prosecution of reporters for news-gathering activities, unquote, and called on the DOJ to drop both the extradition request and the case against Assange. Meanwhile, Julia Hall, Amnesty International's Deputy Research Director for Europe, called the UK Supreme Court ruling a blow to justice and said the U.S. should drop the charges against Assange. She noted that the lower court, which the UK Supreme Court had overturned, had recognized that extradition could present a threat to Assange's life or mental health, a risk the Supreme Court airily dismissed based on a breezy U.S. assurance like, don't worry, he'll be fine, don't worry about it. Hall dismissed that assurance as empty promises. And considering the U.S.'s record of CIA black sites, Gitmo, along with the conditions to be found in almost any U.S. jail, not to mention the treatment inflicted on Chelsea Manning in pursuit of this case, and the U.S. government has been pursuing Assange for a dozen years across 3 presidents, the description empty promises is pretty hard to deny. Meanwhile, Reporters Without Borders said it was deeply disappointed by the court decision and called on the Home Office to refuse extradition of Assange. So, why have you heard so little about this? Why has this case not been bigger news? Well, for one reason, major media outlets are convinced that whatever is done to Assange and WikiLeaks will be carefully defined in such a way as that will not affect powerful interests like them. Put more bluntly, they figure they're safe, so they don't care. He was useful when he was around, but if he's not, well, so it goes. In other words, he's not really a journalist, so, the idea of a free press doesn't apply to him. Dodge. Which is actually quite astonishing, because a key part of what Assange is accused of amounts to working with Manning to conceal her identity, that is, to remain anonymous and avoid being prosecuted while releasing the information. But if that's criminal, those major outlets are equally at risk. Consider this image here, okay? This image is a screenshot from a page of the website of the New York Times, nyt.com/tips. It openly invites people to send tips and information to the Times, and then goes on to discuss ways for the tipster to remain anonymous, including Secure Drop, a system set up by the Times for exactly that purpose. Which really means, of course, that the major media's essential ignoring of this case is based less on he's not really a journalist and more on, well, we're too powerful, they won't dare come after us. Which may, however, be true of the publishers, but not of their reporters, without which the publishers, of course, can't get the scoops that bring in the eyes and ears of the public. After the government lost the famous Pentagon Papers case against the New York Times, the government tried to go after reporter Neil Sheehan on exactly the same charge that Assange now faces, using exactly the same "it's a conspiracy" argument. Fortunately for Sheehan, at that point, they couldn't get the grand jury to indict. So, okay. Even leaving all that "can't touch this" corporate attitude aside. You think the progressive left would keep pushing it, or even, in fact, the libertarian right, which is often on the right side of history on things like, press freedom. Well, some of the left did try. I mean, heck, I've mentioned the case at least 20 times over the years. But the major voices of what passes for the left in the U.S. these days, these faux progressives, those whose progressive and radical proposals expand and contract with the ideas prominent in intra-Democratic Party policy debates, those people have fallen largely silent. And frankly, we can even pinpoint when that happened and why. When WikiLeaks released documents embarrassing to the Bush administration, when it released footage useful in opposing the Iraq War, WikiLeaks was the hero. But as soon as WikiLeaks first released documents embarrassing to Barack Obama's administration, those faux progressives started to attack it and stood by silently as the amazing Mr. O tried to bankrupt WikiLeaks by blocking its access to donations and was desperately searching for a way to imprison Julian Assange. The final break came when WikiLeaks invoked the unforgivable curse. This was in 2016. They released emails embarrassing to Hillary Clinton. The emails showed that during the primaries, her campaign in the DNC had colluded to the detriment of the Bernie Sanders campaign. Well, that was it. Criticize the Democratic Party presidential nominee, and Assange and WikiLeaks immediately became part of some anti-American cabal. Indeed, on one of the, and quite possibly biggest of these faux progressive sites, Daily Kos, Assange became routinely described by the homophobic term Putin's butt boy, with the frequent addendum that he's always been about. WikiLeaks has always been about pushing pro-Russian, anti-American propaganda, probably under the direction of the Kremlin. The fact that this also amounted to an admission that they had been useful idiots during the time that they had celebrated WikiLeaks was, of course, passed over without comment. This is an issue I have let slide too long and which too much of the supposedly progressive left have simply ignored or even dismissed. This silence cannot be allowed to continue. The case against Julian Assange represents a genuine threat to journalism as a principle. This silence must stop. The threat must be stopped. The case should be dropped. Julian Assange must be freed. Okay, that's pretty much it for this week, for this time out. Glad to be back with a little bit more of a regular show than I've been able to do recently. More news. Again, if you have any response to anything I've said, I mean, my website has been up a couple of times in the show. My personal email has been up a couple of times. I do respond to my email. I'm kind of slow about it, but I do respond to it. So comments and questions are always welcome. But with that, I will leave you for now and just tell you that we'll see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.